The people who change your life rarely arrive when you are looking for them. They appear when you decide to help someone else. I remember the exact moment everything began. It was a Thursday evening in late September, and the sun was disappearing behind the Boston skyline. The air carried that first hint of autumn, cool enough for a light jacket, quiet enough to hear leaves scraping across the sidewalk. My shift at the community library had ended 30 minutes earlier. I was walking home through Riverside Park, taking the longer route like I often did when I needed time to think. The park was nearly empty. A few joggers moved along the path. An elderly couple sat near the fountain. The playground stood silent beneath fading golden light. I was halfway across the park when I heard it, crying, soft at first, almost hidden by the wind. I stopped walking. For a moment I thought I imagined it. Then I heard it again. A small voice. A child's voice. Something in my chest tightened immediately. I followed the sound toward a row of benches near the pond. The closer I got, the clearer it became. Sitting alone on a wooden bench was a little girl who could not have been older than 7. Her blonde hair had come loose from a braid. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Her small hands gripped the edge of the bench as though she was afraid to let go. No parent stood nearby. No guardian. No family member. Just a frightened child sitting alone as daylight faded around her. I glanced across the park. Nothing. No one appeared to be looking for her. Several people walked past without stopping. One man glanced in her direction before continuing on his way. A woman pushing a stroller looked concerned but kept moving. The little girl lowered her head and wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. Something about that simple gesture broke my heart. I stepped closer. "Hey there," I said gently. She looked up immediately. Her blue eyes were filled with fear. "Are you okay?" The question felt foolish the moment it left my mouth. Clearly she was not okay. The little girl hesitated before shaking her head. Fresh tears appeared instantly. I sat down beside her, leaving enough space so she would not feel uncomfortable. "My name is Hannah." She stared at me for several seconds. Then her voice emerged as little more than a whisper. "Sophie. That is a beautiful name." She looked down again. Silence settled between us. The sky continued darkening overhead. Streetlights flickered on around the park one by one. I could tell Sophie was trying very hard not to cry again. Children often think being brave means hiding their fear. Adults do the same thing. "Are you lost?" I asked softly. Sophie nodded. "I cannot find anyone." The words came out trembling. My stomach sank. "Do you know where your family is?" Another shake of her head. "Do you have a phone number?" Sophie hesitated. Then she whispered something unexpected. "I am not supposed to talk to strangers." Despite the situation, I smiled. "That is actually very smart." For the first time, a tiny smile appeared on her face. It vanished almost immediately, but I saw it. Around us, the park continued growing darker. Evening shadows stretched across the grass. The pond reflected the last traces of orange sunlight. Sophie glanced nervously around the empty pathways. I followed her gaze. Whoever she was waiting for had not arrived. Whoever she belonged with was nowhere in sight. I looked back at the frightened little girl sitting alone on that bench. Then I made a decision. "Okay," I said gently. "Here is what we are going to do." Sophie looked up. "I am not leaving until we find your family." For the first time since I arrived, relief softened her expression. She believed me. And sitting there beside that lonely bench, I thought I was helping a lost little girl. I had absolutely no idea that somewhere in Boston, one of the most powerful men in the city was already searching for her. The promise seemed simple when I made it. Stay with Sophie until we found her family. Yet as the minutes passed, I began realizing how little I actually knew about the little girl sitting beside me. The evening air grew cooler. A breeze carried fallen leaves across the pathway. Somewhere beyond the trees, traffic hummed softly from the streets surrounding the park. Sophie pulled her sweater tighter around her small shoulders and glanced nervously toward the darkening entrance. Every few seconds she looked as though she expected someone to appear. Nobody did. "Are you hungry?" I asked. She hesitated before nodding. The answer was so quiet I almost missed it. I reached into my bag and found the granola bar I usually saved for my walk home. "Here." Sophie accepted it carefully. Thank you. She unwrapped it and took a small bite. The relief on her face made my heart ache. Children should never have to look grateful for something so small. We sat together while the last traces of daylight faded beyond the pond. Do you remember where you saw your family last? I asked. Sophie thought for a moment. Near the fountain. I looked toward the center of the park. And then, there were lots of people. Her voice trembled again. I turned around and everybody was gone. I could imagine how frightening that must have felt. Do you know your address? Sophie shook her head. What about your phone number? Another shake. Then she looked down at her hands. I usually do not need to remember things like that. Something about the answer caught my attention. Most children her age knew at least one emergency number. Sophie spoke as though someone always handled those details for her. Do you remember your parents' name? I asked gently. For the first time, hesitation appeared. Not confusion. Hesitation. My daddy. What is his name? Sophie stared toward the pond. I am not supposed to tell people. The response surprised me. Even when you are lost? She bit her lip. Especially then. A strange feeling settled in my chest. Whoever raised this child had taught her to be extremely careful. Far more careful than most 7-year-olds. Before I could ask another question, Sophie suddenly pointed toward a police officer walking along the pathway. Can we tell him? Relief washed through me. That is a great idea. The officer listened patiently while Sophie explained she had become separated from her family. He knelt to her eye level and spoke with remarkable kindness. After several questions, however, the situation remained unchanged. Sophie still refused to share her father's name. The officer eventually radioed dispatch and requested assistance locating missing child reports. While we waited, Sophie remained glued to my side. Almost instinctively, she reached for my hand. I squeezed gently. Everything is going to be okay. She nodded. Then she whispered something so softly I nearly did not hear it. He is going to be worried. Your father. Sophie nodded again. Fear mixed with certainty in her expression. He always finds me. The words should have sounded comforting. Instead, they sounded absolute. Almost like a fact. 20 minutes later, headlights appeared beyond the park gates. Then another set. And another. Several black SUVs entered the nearby parking area. Every vehicle stopped at nearly the same moment. The police officer straightened immediately. Sophie stood so quickly the granola wrapper slipped from her lap. Her eyes widened with sudden relief. And as men in dark suits began stepping from the vehicles, I realized whoever was searching for this little girl was far more powerful than I had ever imagined. The atmosphere changed the moment those vehicles arrived. Even the park seemed quieter. The police officer who had been speaking with Sophie lowered his radio and straightened his posture. Men in dark suits moved quickly but calmly across the pathway, scanning every corner of the park. None of them appeared panicked. Yet every movement carried urgency. Sophie squeezed my hand tighter. For the first time since I met her, she was smiling. Not a nervous smile. A relieved one. They found me, she whispered. I followed her gaze toward the center SUV. The rear door opened. A tall man stepped out. He wore a dark overcoat over an expensive charcoal suit. The fading light caught sharp features and dark hair touched with the slightest hint of silver near the temples. Even from a distance, his presence seemed to change the space around him. People noticed him immediately. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. The police officer beside us quietly exhaled. Sophie did not hesitate. The moment she saw him, she ran. Daddy! Her voice echoed across the pathway. The man crossed the distance quickly and dropped to one knee just as she reached him. Sophie wrapped both arms around his neck. For several seconds, neither moved. The scene was unexpectedly simple. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just a father holding his daughter after a frightening evening. Relief softened his expression in a way that transformed him completely. Whatever authority surrounded him disappeared in that moment. He was simply a parent who had found his child. I looked away briefly, feeling as though I was witnessing something private. When I glanced back, Sophie was speaking rapidly while pointing in my direction. The man's eyes followed her gesture. Then he stood. For a moment, our gazes met across the park. Something unreadable passed through his expression. Gratitude, perhaps. Or curiosity. A few moments later he approached. Two suited men remained several steps behind him. Not close enough to interfere. Close enough to observe. You stayed with her. His voice was calm and controlled. Of course. I glanced toward Sophie. She was scared. His eyes lingered on me for a second longer than expected. Most people would have called someone and left. I shrugged. That did not feel right. Sophie immediately appeared beside him and grabbed his hand. She gave me her snack. The little girl sounded proud of this fact. The man's gaze shifted briefly toward the empty granola wrapper near the bench, then back to me. Thank you. The sincerity in those two words caught me off guard. Wealthy or powerful people often sounded accustomed to being listened to. This man sounded genuinely grateful. She helped me too, I said. She was very brave. Sophie smiled brightly. The man looked down at his daughter. Some of the tension left his shoulders. Then his attention returned to me. My name is Luca. He offered no last name. Somehow it felt intentional. Hannah. We shook hands. His grip was firm but respectful. Around us, the suited men relaxed slightly. The police officer exchanged a few words with one of them before walking away. Everything seemed resolved. Yet something about the situation still felt unusual. Sophie tugged gently on Luca's sleeve. Can Hannah come with us for dinner? The question was so unexpected that I laughed softly. Luca looked almost surprised himself. Then Sophie added, I want her to meet everyone. Luca glanced at me, and for the briefest moment, I had the strange feeling that this was not the last time our paths would cross. I almost said no. The invitation felt too unexpected, too personal. Yet Sophie looked at me with such hope that refusing seemed impossible. Maybe another time, I said gently. Her shoulders dropped immediately. Luca noticed. It is only dinner, he said. A thank you. Nothing more. Sophie brightened again. I found myself smiling despite my hesitation. 30 minutes later, I was sitting in the back seat of an SUV wondering how a normal walk home had somehow become this. The city lights blurred beyond the windows as we crossed Boston. Sophie sat beside me talking almost non-stop. She told me about her favorite books, her school, and her obsession with chocolate chip pancakes. Every few minutes she asked another question. Do you like dogs? Yes. Do you like ice cream? Of course. Do you like castles? I laughed. I have never been inside one. Me neither, she said seriously. But I want one. Even Luca smiled at that. It was the first time I saw something warm break through his carefully controlled exterior. The tension I felt earlier began to fade. Whatever else he might be, he clearly adored his daughter. Eventually the vehicles entered a private road lined with trees. Ahead stood an enormous estate overlooking the harbor. Soft lights illuminated stone walls and perfectly maintained gardens. The house looked less like a home and more like something from a movie. I stared through the window. Sophie noticed immediately. Pretty, right? Pretty felt like an understatement. Inside, the atmosphere surprised me even more. I expected cold luxury. Instead, I found warmth. Family photographs covered several walls. Children's drawings hung near the kitchen entrance. Fresh flowers decorated the dining room. The space felt lived in. Sophie practically dragged me through half the house before dinner. Every room seemed to contain another story she wanted to share. By the time we reached the dining room, I realized something important. Sophie had been lonely, not neglected, not unhappy, just lonely. She seemed excited simply to have someone new willing to listen. Dinner itself was remarkably normal. Soup, roasted chicken, vegetables, fresh bread. Nothing extravagant despite the setting. Conversation flowed easily, mostly because Sophie refused to let silence exist. At one point she proudly informed everyone that I had stayed with her when nobody else did. She promised not to leave, Sophie said. And she did not. Luca looked at me across the table. That meant a great deal. His voice remained calm, but the sincerity behind it was unmistakable. I shrugged slightly. Anyone would have done the same. No, his answer came immediately. Not everyone. The room fell quiet for a moment. I looked away first. Something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable. Not because it felt wrong, because it felt true. Later that evening, as dinner ended and I prepared to leave, Sophie hugged me unexpectedly. "Will I see you again?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Before I could answer, Luca spoke. "That depends on whether Hannah wants to." Sophie looked up at me hopefully. I smiled. "I think that can be arranged." Her grin returned instantly. As one of the staff members escorted me toward the front entrance, I glanced back. Sophie waved enthusiastically from the staircase. Luca stood behind her, watching quietly. For a brief moment our eyes met again. Then the doors closed. As the SUV carried me home through the city, I could not shake the feeling that tonight had been the beginning of something neither of us had expected. The following week should have felt ordinary. Instead, I found myself thinking about Sophie far more often than I expected. Every time I walked through Riverside Park, I remembered the frightened little girl sitting alone on that bench. Every time I passed a bakery, I remembered her passionate argument about why chocolate chip pancakes were superior to every other breakfast food. Some people leave impressions on your life quietly. Sophie seemed determined to leave one loudly. Tuesday afternoon proved that. I was shelving books at the library when my phone vibrated. The number was unfamiliar. Normally I ignored unknown calls. Something made me answer anyway. "Hello. Hannah." Sophie's voice exploded through the speaker. I nearly dropped a book. "Sophie, I got your number from Dad." I laughed despite myself. "Did you?" "Yes. And I need help." The urgency in her tone immediately caught my attention. "What happened?" "I have a school project." Relief washed through me. "That sounds survivable." "Not according to me." Her dramatic sigh made me smile. For the next 10 minutes, Sophie explained every detail of an assignment involving community heroes. Apparently she had decided I was the perfect person to interview. By the time the call ended, I found myself agreeing to meet her after school later that week. When I hung up, one of my coworkers raised an eyebrow. "You sound happier." I blinked. "Doi." "Definitely." The observation followed me for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, across the city, Luca Moretti sat through a meeting while barely paying attention to the presentation in front of him. His focus shifted the moment one of his assistants entered the room. "Everything all right?" Luca asked. The assistant nodded. "Your daughter called Hannah again." Several people around the conference table exchanged amused looks. Luca closed the folder in front of him. "And they are meeting Friday." A faint smile appeared before disappearing just as quickly. "Good." The meeting continued, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He told himself his interest was entirely because of Sophie. She had not stopped talking about Hannah since the night at the park. Yet another part of him knew that explanation was becoming less convincing every day. Friday arrived with bright autumn sunshine. School ended early, and Sophie insisted on showing me every corner of a local science museum. She rushed from exhibit to exhibit while explaining facts she had memorized. By the end of the afternoon, I was exhausted simply trying to keep up. Luca arrived later to pick her up. Sophie immediately launched into a detailed summary of the entire day. And then Hannah helped me build the bridge. "A very small bridge," I corrected. "It still worked." Sophie crossed her arms. "That is what matters." Luca laughed quietly. The sound surprised me. I realized I had never heard him laugh before. Changed his entire face. Made him seem younger somehow. More approachable. Less like a man people whispered about. As the afternoon sunlight faded across the museum courtyard, Sophie suddenly grabbed both our hands. "Perfect." Luca and I exchanged confused looks. "What is perfect?" I asked. Now both my favorite people are standing together. Neither of us seemed prepared for that answer. Sophie smiled proudly while Luca looked away toward the courtyard fountain. For reasons I could not explain, I felt my face grow warm. A few moments later, Sophie ran ahead toward the entrance, leaving Luca and me alone for the first time in days. The silence felt different now. Easier. More familiar. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For making her smile." I watched Sophie skipping across the pavement beneath falling autumn leaves. Then I looked back at him. What neither of us realized was that someone had already started noticing how often our paths were crossing. And those observations would soon create complications neither of us expected. The change began so subtly that I almost missed it. A glance that lingered too long. A conversation that stopped when I entered a room. A curious question disguised as casual interest. First I dismissed it. Then the pattern became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, I arrived at the library to find my supervisor watching me with unusual amusement. "What?" I asked. She smiled over the top of a stack of returned books. "Nothing." "That is never a good answer." Her smile widened. "You have a mysterious admirer." I nearly dropped the books in my hands. "Excuse me." Someone sent a donation. My confusion deepened. People donate to libraries all the time. Not usually with a handwritten note requesting that new children's reading programs be named after a librarian who inspired them.
Ich zerrte her.
"What?" She handed me a small card. The message was simple. "Thank you for helping children feel safe.
No signature. No explanation."
My stomach immediately tightened. I already had a suspicion about who might be responsible. Later that evening, I found myself standing outside the estate once again. Sophie had invited me to attend a small school fundraiser being hosted on the property. The event itself was charming. Families filled the gardens. Children ran between activity tables. Local teachers and community volunteers mingled beneath strings of warm lights. Nothing about it felt intimidating. In fact, it felt surprisingly normal. Sophie found me within seconds of my arrival. "You came." She launched herself into a hug before dragging me toward a display she had helped create. "Look what we made." The project featured photographs and drawings celebrating people who made a difference in the community. Teachers, volunteers, firefighters, librarians, parents. Sophie proudly pointed toward one picture in particular. It was me. I laughed. "I do not belong next to firefighters." "Yes, you do." Her certainty left no room for argument. As the fundraiser continued, I noticed something else. People treated Luca differently. Not with fear. With respect. Teachers greeted him warmly. Community leaders thanked him for supporting local programs. Parents approached to express gratitude. The image I had imagined after seeing the security teams and endless black vehicles felt increasingly incomplete. There was clearly much more to him than appearances suggested. Near sunset, I found myself standing alone beside a garden overlooking the harbor. The water reflected shades of orange and gold beneath the evening sky. Footsteps approached quietly. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. "You are avoiding the crowd," Luca observed. I could say the same thing. A faint smile appeared. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The harbor breeze carried the scent of salt water and autumn leaves. "The donation was you, wasn't it?" I asked finally. Luca did not immediately answer, which was answer enough. "The library deserved it," he said. "The library or the librarian?" His expression shifted slightly. Not defensive. Thoughtful. Both. The honesty caught me off guard. Before I could respond, laughter echoed from the lawn. Sophie was racing across the grass with several friends, completely carefree. Luca watched her for a moment. The pride in his eyes was impossible to miss. "She talks about you constantly," he admitted. "She talks about you too." His smile grew. "I know." The simplicity of that response made me laugh. For the first time since meeting him, the conversation felt effortless, natural, comfortable. Yet neither of us noticed the woman standing across the garden near the fundraiser entrance. She watched us for several seconds before quietly turning away. And something about the expression on her face suggested that the complications approaching our lives were much closer than either of us realized. Some storms arrive with thunder. Others arrive with a polite smile and perfect timing. 3 days after the fundraiser, I learned that not everyone was happy about how often Luca and I appeared in the same place. It happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon at the library. The children's reading hour had just ended. Parents gathered coats. Books returned to shelves. The usual rhythm of the building continued around me. Then the front desk called my name. "Hannah, someone is here to see you." I expected a parent, maybe a volunteer. Instead, I found a woman standing near the entrance. She looked elegant and composed, dressed in a tailored cream coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her smile was polite. Her eyes were not. "Hannah Brooks," she asked. Yes. She extended her hand. My name is Victoria Ellis. The name meant nothing to me. At least not yet. It is nice to meet you. Likewise. Her smile remained flawless. I was hoping we could talk. 30 minutes later we sat in a nearby coffee shop. The entire conversation felt strangely uncomfortable from the beginning. Victoria knew far too much about me. She knew where I worked. She knew about Sophie. She knew about the fundraiser. Eventually she stopped pretending. You have become quite important to them. I frowned. Them. Luca and Sophie. The way she said their names immediately explained everything. You know them. Very well. She stirred her coffee slowly. I have known Luca for years. Something cold settled in my stomach. Victoria leaned forward slightly. I am only trying to help. Whenever people began sentences that way, trouble usually followed. Help me understand what? Her expression softened. The world you are stepping into. I remained silent. Luca lives a very different life from yours. I am aware of that. Are you? Her tone remained pleasant. Because people tend to get hurt when they forget how different those worlds can be. The warning was subtle, deliberate, not cruel. Somehow that made it worse. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then I pushed my chair back. Thank you for your concern.
Victoria watched me stand.
You are a good person, Hannah. Her voice followed me. That is exactly why I hope you are careful. I left without responding. The conversation lingered long after it ended. That evening, Sophie called while I was making dinner. Normally her voice immediately improved my mood. Not this time. You sound sad, she announced after less than 10 seconds.
Doi.
Yes. I smiled despite myself. Children noticed everything. Just a long day. Sophie accepted the explanation but only barely. Before ending the call, she made me promise to attend her school presentation the following week. I agreed. Afterward I sat alone by the apartment window watching city lights appear across Boston. Victoria's words continued echoing in my thoughts. Different worlds. Different lives. Different futures. Maybe she was right. Across the city, Lucas sat in his office reviewing reports when one of his assistants quietly entered the room. There was a meeting today. Luca looked up immediately. What kind of meeting? The assistant hesitated.
Victoria Ellis visited Hannah Brooks.
The room became very still. Luca closed the folder in front of him. His expression remained calm. Too calm. Did Hannah know who Victoria was? No. Luca stood and walked toward the window overlooking the harbor. Below, the city glowed beneath the evening sky. Somewhere out there, Hannah was probably questioning things she had never questioned before. And for the first time since meeting her, Luca realized that protecting someone from danger was often easier than protecting them from doubt. The next week felt longer than it should have. Victoria's warning continued following me everywhere. Not because I believed every word she said. Because a small part of me feared she might be right. Different worlds. Different lives. Different futures. The problem was that every time I tried to create distance, Sophie somehow pulled me back. Her school presentation arrived on a bright Friday afternoon. The elementary school auditorium buzzed with parents, teachers, and excited children. Handmade posters lined the walls. Folding chairs filled every row. I found my seat near the back just before the presentations began. Several minutes later, another figure quietly took the empty chair beside me. I did not need to look up immediately to know who it was. You made it, Luca said softly. I promised Sophie. So did I. For a moment, neither of us mentioned Victoria. The silence felt deliberate. The auditorium lights dimmed slightly as the presentation started. One by one, students walked onto the stage to discuss people who inspired them. Teachers, family members, athletes, community volunteers. Then Sophie's name was called. She stepped confidently onto the stage carrying a large presentation board. Pride instantly filled Luca's expression. The same feeling unexpectedly appeared inside me. Sophie cleared her throat dramatically before beginning. My project is about heroes. Several parents smiled. Most people think heroes wear uniforms or capes. She paused. I think heroes help people when nobody is watching. The room grew quieter. Sophie pointed toward photographs on her display board. Pictures from community events, the library, school activities. Then she pointed toward one picture in particular. A photograph of me helping children during reading hour. My stomach dropped. This is Hannah. Sophie's voice echoed through the auditorium. She found me when I was lost. Every eye in the room seemed to turn toward me. I wanted to disappear beneath my chair. Sophie continued anyway. She stayed with me because she promised she would. Her voice softened slightly. She did not know who I was. She just wanted to help. Silence settled across the audience. Genuine silence. The kind created when people stop listening politely and start listening emotionally. Sophie smiled. That is why Hannah is my hero. I looked down immediately. Embarrassed. Overwhelmed. Deeply moved. Beside me, Luca remained unusually quiet. When I finally glanced toward him, I saw something unexpected. Emotion. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just enough to reveal how much Sophie's words meant to him. After the presentations ended, parents and children filled the auditorium. Congratulations echoed everywhere. Sophie ran straight toward us. How did I do? You were amazing, I said honestly.
Luca nodded.
Very amazing. Sophie beamed. For several minutes everything felt perfect. Then another voice interrupted. It was a beautiful presentation. I turned. Victoria stood a few feet away. Sophie's smile faded slightly. Luca's expression became unreadable. Victoria remained composed as always. You should be proud, she told Sophie. Thank you, Sophie replied politely. Yet the warmth from earlier had disappeared. The conversation lasted less than a minute before Victoria excused herself. But the damage had already been done. The atmosphere changed. Sophie noticed it. Children always noticed everything. Later, while families exited the school, Sophie tugged gently on my sleeve. Can I tell you a secret? She whispered. Of course. Sophie glanced toward the parking lot where Victoria was speaking with several adults. Then she leaned closer. Dad smiles more when you are around. My heart skipped unexpectedly. Before I could respond, Sophie added something else. And I think she knows it too. I followed Sophie's gaze toward Victoria. For the first time, I realized this situation was no longer just about friendship, gratitude, or coincidence. Somewhere along the way, our lives had become connected in ways none of us could easily ignore. And the decisions waiting ahead would change far more than any of us were prepared for. Sometimes life changes quietly, not with dramatic speeches or impossible coincidences. Sometimes it changes because one person decides to stay when everyone else keeps walking. A month passed after Sophie's presentation. Autumn settled fully over Boston. Golden leaves covered sidewalks. Cool air filled the mornings. The city seemed softer somehow. And despite every complication, our lives continued moving closer together. Victoria eventually stopped appearing. Not because she suddenly approved. Because she finally understood something Luca had already realized. Neither of us was trying to force a future into existence. We were simply allowing it to happen naturally. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie invited me to help organize a community reading event sponsored by one of Luca's foundations. Families filled a renovated community center near the harbor. Children sat cross-legged on colorful rugs listening to stories. Volunteers distributed books. Laughter echoed through every room. It was exactly the kind of place I loved being. Watching children discover new stories never stopped feeling magical. At one point I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath. Through a nearby window I could see the harbor sparkling beneath bright autumn sunlight. Footsteps approached. I smiled before turning around. Let me guess, I said. You escaped too.
Luca laughed quietly.
5 minutes of peace. We stood together looking out at the water. Comfortable silence settled between us. The kind that no longer felt awkward. The kind that felt earned. The center looks incredible, I said. You helped make it happen. I shook my head. I only volunteered. You inspired it. His answer came without hesitation. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then another voice interrupted from down the hallway. Found you. Sophie marched toward us with exaggerated determination. You two are impossible.
Impossible.
I asked. Yes. She crossed her arms. I spend 5 minutes helping children and suddenly both of you disappear.
Luca smiled.
We were standing right here. Exactly. Sophie pointed dramatically. Together. I laughed while Luca looked suspiciously amused. Sophie stared at both of us for several seconds. Then she nodded as if confirming a theory. Good. Good. Luca asked. Very good. Before either of us could question her further, she grabbed our hands and pulled us back toward the event. The afternoon passed in a blur of stories, conversations, and laughter. As the sun began setting, families slowly departed. Volunteers cleaned tables. Children carried home stacks of books. The center gradually grew quiet. Sophie sat near the window watching the harbor glow orange beneath the evening sky. Remember the park? She asked suddenly. I looked at her. Of course. I was really scared. Her voice remained soft. I know. Sophie smiled. But then you stayed. A lump formed in my throat. Across from us, Luca remained silent. Sophie looked between us before continuing. Everything changed after that. She was right. Everything had changed. One choice. One promise. One little girl sitting alone on a bench. The path from that moment to this one seemed impossible to predict. Yet here we were. Not because of fate alone. Because of kindness. Because of trust. Because people chose each other. As darkness settled outside, we left the center together. The harbor lights reflected across calm water. Sophie walked between us holding both our hands. Completely content. Completely certain she belonged exactly where she was. I realized then that the most important part of this story was never about wealth, influence, or reputation. It was about a frightened child who needed help. And a promise made by a stranger who decided not to walk away. Sometimes the people who protect children are the ones who end up finding a family themselves. And sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the beginning of an entirely new life.